Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Babe, SCORAI, and USDN. On behalf of the state of Oregon, I wanted to welcome all of you to our state here. Hope you enjoy your visit and that you don't catch my cold, and that this workshop is rich in ideas, inspiration, moving forward. So this presentation is a light opera. I was going to sing it, but my voice will prevent that, so I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to speak. It comes in 3 acts. And the first act is the myths that keep government from acting on the topic or even talking about sustainable consumption. There are several myths holding us back. And the biggest myth, I believe, is this idea that government in the US doesn't or shouldn't involve itself in addressing consumption. Consumption is a private decision made in a private marketplace, a decision between the consumer, retailer, and producer, free of the long arm of government intervention. Government intervention in the realm of consumption is the role of bureaucrats in failed centralized economies, and in this country, government doesn't have a role. It's a fairly common belief, but it's a myth, and Helena, thank you for exposing it in your presentation, how our current status of consumption is really a creation of government. Government's fingerprints, whether we like it or not, and regardless of our political ideology, are all over consumption in this country, from state and local sales tax to the federal home mortgage deduction, definitely influences consumption. So do labor laws and standards and availability or the lack thereof of access to health insurance and health coverage, a point made by Juliet Shore. Industrial policy, to the extent we have one, it shapes what gets made and how it's made, and so do natural resource policies and subsidies for grazing, lumber, and mining, which all shape the marketplace in which consumption occurs. Trade policy, everyday low prices are very much a product of global trade regimens negotiated by federal governments. The local level, local economic development projects aim to draw people to specific corridors to shop and eat. Government determines and funds transportation routes, which then support the transportation modes which shape consumption. Zoning, urban form, building codes, and environmental policies, from authorizing green power programs to water conservation, transit, limits on the mercury content of light bulbs or phthalates in sippy cups, are all specifically designed to influence consumption. So this idea that consumption is somehow or other new or foreign territory or off limits to government is really just a myth. Another myth is that there's not much government could do, even if we wanted to, other than drop brochures on people out of black helicopters. But just with a little smudge of creativity and a review of the literature shows that there's lots of things government could be doing. And just two examples. I mean, a couple years ago, Leslie Cochin and I co-authored a paper that identified 16 very broad categories of policies and programs that local governments could pursue. And then here's the document that's shareable in the Sustainable Economies Law Center. 35 specific policies focused just on building the sharing economy. Also, another myth is that we will antagonize business. This may antagonize business, but not necessarily. And there's a number of business executives now who are very good at understanding global data and trends, and they get this. So, for example, this report here, show of hands if you've seen it, from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. Who is the World Business Council on Sustainable Development? It's representatives from companies such as Coca-Cola, Adidas, Sony, Weyerhaeuser, and what they say in this report is that global consumption patterns can't be sustained. This is not Bill Reese who wrote this, okay? It's these executives and managers from these companies. They go on and say, thank you, Helena, efficiency gains and technological advances alone won't be sufficient. Changes will be required in consumer lifestyles. They recognize that well-being in this report doesn't rely on high levels of consumption, and that consumers are concerned and are willing to act, but there's a whole host of external barriers keeping them from doing so. Act 2. How did a state agency, the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, come to discuss this topic? For us, its roots are in the solid waste management hierarchy, adopted into state law in the 1980s. Reduce and reuse, then recycle. So this is where we started. Many states give the hierarchy lip service, but about 12 years ago, Oregon decided to put a little bit of dedicated resource into the top tiers of the hierarchy, reduce and reuse. And what we did is we spent the first 5 years or so experimenting. We retooled our solid waste recycling grants program to give preference to reduce and reuse projects. We tried a bunch of things all around the state, and we also did some limited work trying to help businesses reduce their use of materials. Out of that work, we started to get involved in reviewing the environmental impacts of materials through life cycle analysis, and we got involved in material selection, which is not the same as waste prevention. And you can see how we're progressing stepwise away from a limited prevention frame and into a sustainable consumption frame here. After several years of experimentation, we decided we needed to be more strategic. So we helped to develop we developed a waste prevention strategy, and then climate arrived on the scene. And as a consequence of the work we had done to understand the environmental and specifically the climate impacts of materials, we were able to get a seat at the table in the development of several state climate action plans, which further drove this conversation, a few more yards down the field. And then, when it became apparent that the real potential of sustainable consumption and materials management more broadly was constrained by the fact that most of the greenhouse gas benefits in this realm are reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that occur in other states or nations, and therefore don't count as if we have a magic bubble over our atmosphere. That motivated us to develop the state's consumption-based emissions inventory. And when we published that consumption-based emissions inventory, amid much fear and trepidation, when we published that and the sky did not fall on us, it completely legitimized, it somewhat legitimized this topic. And it made it okay for us, safe even in some circles, to talk about consumption. And then finally, a few years ago, when it was time to update the state's solid waste management plan, a handful of us at DEQ said, you know what, this solid waste frame is not very helpful, it's really limiting, it leads to some very bad decisions, let's try a different approach, and thus the materials management vision was born. Materials management vision, which was adopted by our Environmental Quality Commission, is not a consumption document, but it does have in it a track which explicitly addresses consumption and proposes some work that the state and others should do. So finally, Act 3, what have we learned along the way? Well, one of the things we've learned is that conventional sustainability initiatives have some very significant limits. And let me give you an example of this from one of our life cycle studies. I'm going to get a little geeky on you here, but bear with me. These are 5 different environmental impacts associated with drinking water from a polyethylene terephthalate single-use bottle recycled at 2 different rates, 37% and 62%, which are the recycling rates for these bottles in Oregon before and after they were added to our statewide bottle redemption system, the Oregon Bottle Bill. So you can see that increasing the recycling rates for these bottles reduces energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. It's good for the environment, but not really by all that much. And if that's all we can do, we're toast. Fortunately, producers can take some actions. Producers could make their bottles thinner, and many already have, and you see those impacts there in green. But again, if that's all we can do, that's the limit of what producers can do, and this is the most important thing they could do, by the way, then again, we're toast. Consumers, however, can drink out of the tap. And if you drink out of the tap in a reusable bottle and you wash it every single day, and we don't recommend that you do, but that's your choice. If you wash your reusable bottle every single day in the brand or model of home dishwasher, which by the greatest margin ever failed to qualify for the EPA Energy Star program, you get these results. And if you wash your reusable bottle once a week in an Energy Star compliant dishwasher, you get the results shown there in orange, which if you can't see, it's because they're about only 1% of the impact of drinking out of the recyclable bottle and recycling it, okay? So clearly sustainable consumption has a role. There's great environmental benefits here. Unless when you as the consumer drink water out of the tap, because you're saving money, you take those savings and you turn around and spend them on something else. And that is the indirect rebound effect, which causes emissions to go back up. At a meeting in Bentonville, Arkansas, I was interested to hear an executive from Walmart say how much that Walmart loves packaging waste prevention. Because less packaging at Walmart allows them to drive down unit costs. This lowers the price of products that they offer to their customers, and it allows their customers to, quote, live better by using those savings to go and buy more products at Walmart. That is the indirect rebound effect. It is very real, it is not our friend, and we can understand it as follows. This is a scatter diagram of the greenhouse gas emissions, the emissions and emissions intensities of about 300 different commodities purchased by Oregon households. The x-axis, which is logarithmic, is greenhouse gas emissions upstream of the consumer. The y-axis is emissions intensities, which is greenhouse gas emissions per dollar spent. The x-axis crosses the y-axis at the mean. So everything above the x-axis in red are products which have above average emissions intensities. You spend $1 on this stuff in red, and you contribute above average greenhouse gas emissions. So what does this mean from a consume less or consume differently perspective? It means if we can target the items in red and get people to spend $1 less there, and instead spend their dollar on the stuff below the axis in white, overall emissions will go down. But if consumers spend $1 less of the stuff in white and instead spend the dollar on the stuff in red, overall greenhouse gas emissions will go up. So communicating sustainable consumption to households, I would propose, is a very dangerous proposition that can have some very bad unintended consequences. There are, however, opportunities to find allies in unconventional places. I'm not going to say much. Lauren will talk a little bit about it, about our work to advance accessory dwelling units, part of a larger strategy at DEQ to decrease house sizes in this state. But one of the most interesting parts of this story was how we ended up aligning our interests with two very unlikely allies, the Home Builders Associations and AARP, two groups which I never thought DEQ would be working with, and yet at a particular point in time we found our interests aligned and we were able to move some interesting policy initiatives forward. You can work on sustainable consumption without calling it sustainable consumption, and in many instances, including many places in Oregon, the C word is still somewhat dangerous to say. And yet what we're finding is there are a growing number of people who yearn for this conversation. And so if the audience is right, and you can have this conversation and do it well, it can be transformational to talk with people explicitly head-on around the topic of consumption. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.